Hello and welcome to Root Causes, the PKI and Security podcast where a pair of industry veterans talk about all matters digital certificates and PKI. I'm Tim Callan, Chief Compliance Officer at Sectigo, and I'm here with Jason Soroko, CTO of PKI at Sectigo. How you doing today, Jason?
Doing great, Tim. Thanks for having me.
So there's been a pretty important development in the world of SMIME, and we wanted to catch the listeners up on it today.
Email encryption? Let's talk about it.
Not just email. That's one of the things about SMIME, right? SMIME certs, the M in SMIME stands for messaging, but SMIME certs historically have been used for a broad variety of applications, and that's actually one of the bits of complexity here that definitely deserves a place in this conversation. But yes, SMIME certificates are broadly used to attach to email, or they're often broadly used as device certificates. Basically, you put them on something like a laptop, and that handles various login credentials. I'm trying to log into a system, and it looks for the SMIME cert, and it says, okay, the cert's here. I'm going to allow you to go in. And these things very frequently are done through SMIME. And so, the short on the headline is that the CA Browser Forum very recently passed the first ever set of baseline requirements for SMIME certificates.
Okay, so the SSL use case that we know and love, which is putting TLS certificates on your web server in order to be able to encrypt communications between web server and the browser. You get the HTTPS. That's a use case most of us know very well, and it's pretty intuitive in our minds. So that has a lot of baseline requirements through the CAB forum. So what you're saying now is SMIME certificates, which are used for a number of reasons, as you pointed out, email encryption and email system authentication being maybe the top two.
Yep.
You're saying now baseline requirements are coming out for that.
Absolutely. So if we go back in time, and this will harken back to some of our other episodes we've had in the past. If you go back in time, once upon a time, every CA made its own rules, and those rules were often quite opaque, and it was difficult for an outsider to judge to what degree can I trust this certificate and what do I trust about this certificate. And that was fundamentally the genesis of first extended validation and later on baseline requirements. And so, possibly not surprising, it really all started with SSL, right? That being the biggest use case by a long shot. And then we saw code signing, similar thing. And now a decent number of years later, we have seen that SMIME certificates are being brought under BRs because SMIME today is exactly the same situation. Every CA establishes its own SMIME policies. CAs are expected to do a good job, but there's no definition of what good job means. And so, that leads to the same problems that we had with SSL, inconsistent behaviors, inconsistent level of quality, lack of understanding of these behaviors and level of qualities, lack of information to judge which CAs are better and which CAs are worse. All of that stuff is just the day-to-day existence in the SMIME world. And so this was an effort, and it was a long and complicated effort by a number of dedicated people in the CA Browser Forum to change that and make SMIME certificates be more predictable, more understandable, and ultimately more universally trusted.
What are the kinds of properties that are being ruled over here, Tim? Is it the validation process? Is it the certificate profile? What's the main aim?
It's just like with the SSL BRs. It's all of that stuff, right? So there's things like the morphology of a certificate. There's a good amount of attention spent to validation, what a certificate can attest to or not attest to. And if it is attesting to it, how that needs to be proven for the CA. And there's some other general CA operational requirements, just like you have for SSL. You need to have, physical security in your systems, stuff like that. So some of it feels a lot like SSL. It's not really surprising. What's interesting about SMIME is that we did have to deal with these very many different ways that they're being used. And so that's kind of, I think, what we should maybe focus on today. When the BRs come out, there are 4, and let's get to dates too. But when the BRs came out, they have 4 different levels of validation and 3 different what I'll call profiles. And you can imagine it as a 4x3 matrix. So there's 12 boxes. And something can sit in any of those 12 boxes. A cert can sit in any of those 12 boxes. And all of them, at least on day one, are equally legitimate. So let's start with the validation levels. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right. So S/MIME certs used a lot of different ways. Sometimes an individual takes it and they stick it on their email and get on with their lives. Sometimes the company's giving it to you, etc. So just like email's used a lot of different ways. So the validation levels reflect that. So the first validation level is simply called mailbox level. And mailbox level validation is just, we validate the email address. You have to have control of this email address. If you don't have control of this email address, you don't get the cert. We're not going to attest anything else about you. And that's the S/MIME equivalent of a DV certificate, right? DV certificate says, all I'm going to attest is that you control this domain. I don't know who you are, where you are, anything else. I just know you control this domain, right? Same thing with a mailbox level S/MIME cert. All we know is you control the certificate. And just like with DV, this is likely to be the quickest one to issue because there will be an automated thing. You'll be able to respond in real time. You get the email, you click on the thing. Now you've validated that you control the mailbox and you get on with your life, right? So that'll in many ways probably be the quickest and most convenient. Next is what we call organization validation. And organization validation also validates the email address. They all do. But it also validates the name of the company or other organization that you are using the certificate for. It does not validate any individual's name. So this is for the scenario where I want to put an S/MIME certificate on an email address that is not specific to a person. This is sales@companyname.com, customer support@companyname.com, or my email program my marketing promotion that I'm running right now @companyname.com, right? And in that case, if you want to put an S/MIME certificate on that, it doesn't get attached to an individual. It's not your marketing programs manager. It is just the company. And so under those circumstances, we validate the email and the organization name. That's called organization validation. And perhaps not surprisingly, organization validation looks an awful darn lot like what we do today for SSL and code signing, right? Of course, because we're going to use the benefit of all that work we've done for all those years, getting those things optimized and dialed in. Then the third level is what we call sponsored. And sponsored is an individual at an organization. So in this case, we have the email, the organization name, and the individual's name. So this is, if you, Jason, wanted to put an email, an S/MIME on your work email, which I know from experience you have one, and you want it to be associated with your name, this is the one you would get, right? It would be, this is Jason Soroko as a Sectigo employee, and the cert contains all of that information. So that's what we call sponsored. And then the last one's individual. This is for an individual, but it isn't supposed to be associated with an organization. So if you wanted an S/MIME certificate for your own personal email, which I bet you have, then that was what we would do in that case. It would be an email, and it would be the natural person who gets that email regardless of where they're employed, because the company or the organization is not part of this. So those are those 4 validation levels. And maybe validation level isn't quite the right word, but it's the scope of what is validated.
That's great, Tim. Thanks for going through the typology of those. I think it does highlight the kinds of ways that we want to be represented and how our identities are tied to other things. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And a lot, thank you for that. A lot of attention was paid to this point, which is, how are these used in the real world? How can we lasso this craziness without breaking people who are using certificates? Because there was a general acceptance of the idea, well, if we just chase people away from using certificates to not using certificates, we didn't make it better, right? So let's not do that. Let's try to figure out a way where we don't do that. Then there are profiles. I want to think of what order I want to do this. I think let's go strictest to loosest. So the first profile is what we call strict. So a strict S/MIME certificate is only used for the S/MIME purpose. You attach it to email. That is what you do. And if it's set that way in the certificate, then that is the only thing you can actually use it for legally, right? So that's the strictest profile. It's called strict. The next.
No, thanks, Tim. Just want to connect that real quickly to private TLS certificates. So a lot of you might not know, but you can utilize TLS certificates for a lot of things, including encryption, signing, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what is interesting about that is actually regarding the ability to restrict a certificate's usage to one of those things or two of those things out of the three.
Yeah.
And so Tim, what you're saying here is the rule sets for that are now being brought into SMIME, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The next one up the scale or down the scale, depending on how you look at it, is called multipurpose. And multipurpose allows multiple defined purposes. For example, SMIME and document signing. So you say, I'm going to put this on your laptop. You're going to be able to use it to sign documents. You're also going to be able to use it to attach to your email. This is a multipurpose certificate, right? And the AKU is set that way. And that's how you use it. Now, the SMIME and multipurpose profiles are capped at 2 years in term. So you'll be maxed out at 2 years. Again, right now there's no rules. In principle, you could issue a 20-year SMIME certificate, right? Because we don't, but you could. There are no rules, and so those two will be capped at 2 years. And then the last profile is what we call legacy. And legacy is up to 3 years in term, and the rules in general are looser. And the idea there is that's where we're giving everybody a chance to transition. So you can get legacy, you can order legacy certificates. They work pretty effectively in the scenarios you're using them for today. You start plugging them in, and then you know that you're going to have a certain amount of time where you're going to have to be able to fit into these specific set of requirements that are in the BRs. And in that kind of time frame, that's going to have to happen. But there's a lot of time built in there because the terms are allowed to be up to 3 years. And there's time between now and when the new SMIME BRs actually come into effect. And there will be time between when the BRs come into effect and when those get deprecated. But the understanding that is unambiguous, that has already been discussed in the CAB forum discussion about this, and everybody who's involved is really kind of in principle in agreement, is we are going to return to this and build a deprecation plan and a deprecation schedule into the rules so that the legacy profile in the long run will go away. And, again, we telegraph it well in advance, let people know that this is coming so they can see it. Don't break what they have today, but also make it clear that, look, here's a clear schedule, and in this schedule, this you're going to have to transition. And that's believed, and I think effectively, or I think correctly, that's believed to be the best alternative for enforcing rigor around SMIME, as I was saying, without just chasing people away from certificate use altogether.
That seems very reasonable. I think 2 years is well-considered time frame, and the ability to allow for legacy usage with that well-telegraphed time frame change. Tim, I think this really sounds like somebody did some really good hard thinking about this.
It was a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, and I'm sure it was, and it's not easy to bring that many people with different opinions all together. So I'm glad it happened.
Yeah, and then the other thing probably is the timing. So as I said, the baseline requirements were passed. There's always some amount of time between when a requirement is passed and when it goes into effect, right? Because we all understand that, people don't just snap their fingers and things are done. And so in this case, the exact date is still a little wiggly, but more or less September 1, 2023, basically, will be the date that this goes into effect. So by that date, then CAs will need to follow these rules for the public SMIME certificates that they issue the exact same way they need to follow the rules for the TLS and the code signing certificates that they issue.
So for the end user of SMIME certificates, and I'm thinking especially at the enterprise level or even at the personal level, there doesn't seem to be a ton to have to worry about. A lot of it is at the CA end, and it's all about keeping ourselves honest and making sure that we're measurable and against a set of rules. That's all very, very good. Thinking of those end users, it does sound like there will be some options probably when you are subscribing to an SMIME or when you're going to get SMIME provision to yourselves. It does sound like there'll be some decisions to be made which are all positive. And for those of you who are security conscious, that's why I did bring up that extra little point about the ability to think about your SMIME certificates the same way as TLS, in the sense that you can now restrict which I think is a great option. If you're just using them for email, use that strict option. It just makes sense.
Yeah. And yeah, so for the end user, the individual who has it on their computer and they're just doing their thing, it's not going to really change in a meaningful way. Yeah. You're right. The CA actually has a bunch of stuff. The organizations that are getting these certificates for their employees to use are going to have to understand, right? What certificate do I think I'm getting? Am I getting the certificate that I really want? There are 4 different validation profiles. There are 3 different purpose profiles. And how am I going to make sure that I'm picking the right things, right? And so that might require a little bit of thinking that isn't really required when one kind of certificate can do everything. But this isn't difficult. IT organizations do harder things all the time. It's just, it's now a part of the consideration set that will have to be in the mix when right now there's not really a choice to be made.
Ultimately, it's positive because both dimensions of the matrix, both decision-making trees that you have to go down, basically are security contexts. How are you using these certs?
Yeah.
And it's a good thing to make those choices explicitly, and now you'll be able to. So it's positive.
I agree with you. I think this was well done. It's a tough one. And early on when we were discussing this, everybody kind of said, this is going to require a lot of thought and consideration. And I think that thought and consideration occurred. I think we wound up in the right place. I think we have the right first draft BRs. I mean, we'll change them, of course. We always change them, right? But we have the right first draft BRs. And this is definitely a positive step forward for SMIME certificates.
Great podcast, Tim. I now know a lot more about what this change is. I've heard a lot about it, and now I feel like I've got a grasp on it, and I could probably repitch it. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Jason. This has been Root Causes.